wonderful to be here in what is, without a shadow of doubt, the most spectacular setting of any of the launches, including yesterday in Brodie's in Glasgow. I have to say, pretty fine view there as well, but it's absolutely amazing. And daylight screens too, fantastic. Okay, we'll get going. No, that won't change the slides. That will switch my mic off. So, as Joe said, this piece of work follows that from 2018, Scotland's Urban Age, and the primary objectives of this piece of work was to look at what has changed, what stayed the same, what's new, and without being too Rumsfeldian about it, what don't we know, or what is unknown. And to do so in the context of the COVID pandemic in particular, but recognize that coming out of the COVID pandemic is now intimately interlinked with the climate emergency and what we are doing on decarbonisation or decarboning. We'll come to that in a moment or two. And also within the shadow of both Brexit and the global financial crash. So there's a sort of toxic relationship of cycle of change there. A lot of words here. Don't expect you to read them all, of course. They're just prompts for me, really. These were the 10 findings from Urban Age 1, which first of all looked at the fact that, well, the purpose of Urban Age 1 was to set the principal Scottish cities within global trends, and to examine the degree to which those did or did not apply to Scotland's cities. And the first one of those being a paradigm shift across the global north from the industrial city to the knowledge city, within the context of the fact that we're in the century of the city, as highlighted by the UN, the first time in global history that more people have lived in cities than in the rural area. And in spite of the dynamics that we see around about the COVID pandemic and things, there's no change to that. In fact, we can't accommodate the number of people in the world unless we live predominantly in cities. The forecast is 70-30 for the world, but of course, Scotland and Britain long since passed that. Scotland and Britain are about 70-30 at the moment, depends how you define a city. The US is 82% in cities, same with Canada and Australia and things like that. The second thing was about the trends and the interaction of those trends. I'll come back to that. But these trends for cities and those who govern the cities interact in a way that can be made benign, but unless the interaction is sensible, it's more likely to be toxic for the cities and their peoples. The third thing that we thought was very interesting at the time is the proposition that the jet age and the net age together have combined to cause urban concentration. There's issues around about that, but essentially concentration in the cities. Now, some of us might remember Francis Cairncross's work, The Death of Distance, when we started to deal with the internet, before the Internet of Things, and Cairncross thought we would all be teleworking from Skye, and we would not need to come together unless we wanted to. In fact, the precisely opposite thing happened. And with the paradigm shift to the knowledge city, where the only locational requirement was one of proximity, the opposite happened. We had urban concentration on a big scale. And that has been obviously something that has been challenged by COVID. The global north, we talked about super cities as a UN term rather than mega cities. Super cities being clusters of cities that borrow scale from one another, but don't have one mega centre. And we speculated about whether or not the UK was in fact a super city system rather than a mega city with satellites, or both indeed. Even as recently as 2018, some cities in the UK were trying to replicate earlier success, others were trying to reinvent themselves. There's a lot of work done in this by the Centre for Cities in particular, about the success of trying to replicate earlier success, or indeed reinvention, and we looked at the three cities in that regard. We found that all of Scotland's cities were what we described as proto-knowledge cities, which I have, as I've been saying this week, got into a lot of trouble with the BBC for using a phrase like proto-knowledge. Brian, this is reporting Scotland. You can't say proto-knowledge cities. You need to sort of struck out proto-knowledge and all reference to meta-concepts and things after that for my dealings with the media. We found the Scottish cities reflect the international trends, particularly concentration. I'll come back to that. Scotland's cities have got a familial likeness. 4 years ago, Aberdeen and Edinburgh were performing very well. There were clouds on the horizon, maybe for Aberdeen. Glasgow was transitioning well, but dealing, of course, with its post-industrial legacy. And we made the point about the interconnected nature, we believed, of Scotland's cities. So the Age 22 report follows this sequence. All I'm going to try and do, I'm sorry, it takes a wee while, is pull out some of the principal highlights and then discuss some of the conclusions to the work. So I'm going to talk mainly around about city systems, knowledge and neighbourhoods. The chapters 3 and 4 are deep dives into the cities to demonstrate that we have redone the work. Obviously, one of the problems, of course, is with the data, because even towards the end of 21, when we were starting to pull this together and writing up the report, we're dealing with data that's 2020. So we haven't seen the whole implications of the pandemic, but we can understand something that's going on, and Mark's work in particular gives us realities in terms of precedents and choices. Okay. First thing I want to stress is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We took that in some respects, so it was more the New Urban Age we took as the starting point in 2018. On the left here, we've got the familiar circle of the Sustainable Development Goals, and on the right, we've got the flower that the Scottish Government uses for the National Performance Framework, not to be confused with the other NPF, National Planning Framework, how to confuse people. And the transition between the 17 global development goals, which are, of course, principles, if you like, and the 11 national outcomes in the National Performance Framework, which are broken down into a further 81. I'm afraid I'm on record in Geneva at the UN when asked about what do you think about 17 Sustainable Development Goals, saying, well, 70 is a prime number. 5 would be better. If you've got 5 minutes stuck in a lift with the mayor, and the mayor says, tell me about this anyway. This is floor 4, I have to get out now, and you're only at goal number 3. You're not going to be able to get the point across, if you like. Nonetheless, I think we would contend that this does now infuse most of the things that are done or we are doing. Congratulations to the Scottish Government, who were quick out of the traps in terms of adopting the Sustainable Development Goals and infusing that into a lot of what we do. On the right, a couple of publications. The one at the top, Scottish Government's. Why is it these days that we feel compelled to make every publication look like it's the Beano or the Dandy? If you open, it's full of charts and really interesting information. There's no kind of the Sustainable Development Goals as seen through the eyes of Beryl the Pearl. But it's something about the nature of publications that we do these days, treating people's attention span as being extremely, oh, that looks interesting, I'll have a look, and then you open it up and it's full of charts. chart, which is much the same about Scotland's Urban Age 2022. I have to say. The one at the bottom is interesting. It's published by the Scottish Funding Council, who are of course part of the consortium of partners who supported this work, and looks at the impact of Scottish research in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals globally, which is quite significant, I think, when we think about knowledge as the means of production. Scottish Funding Council wanting to be seen to be engaged in knowledge exchange and the relationship between these things. It's a very interesting piece of work by the SFC. Well, just another colourful wee slide, really to bring this point home. On the left here, you've got Scottish Government's Housing Strategy 2040, and the colourful stuff in the middle relates to a lot of the aims, objectives and outcomes for the 2040 strategy, relating them to the national outcomes. I think we can expect to see this more and more, and it becomes very interesting when we relate this, as I will in a minute or two, towards the levelling up work of the UK government. On the left was the cycle of change that we discussed in 2018. On the right, the cycle of change as it is today. They are ostensibly the same thing, but the two aspects that we have made more explicit, although they were dealt with implicitly in 2018, is what we now talk about as the well-being economy, if you like, and well-being being at the centre of all of this. And that, of course, also takes us to matters related to the ESG agenda, which has been embraced to a greater or lesser extent by the private sector, and we saw that very clearly at COP26 last year in Glasgow, where the private sector was pushing the politicians as much as anything else. Of course, what this has taught us all, and I think here you see at the bottom of that refer to decarboning. Somebody yesterday at the Glasgow launch talked about decarbonate. My problem with decarbonisation sounds a little bit like denazification. You know, it's something that you're going to roll out and do to people, and we don't stand much chance really of decarboning unless we do it with people. So although the principal forces were and always are demographic change, technological change and climate change, in history actually as well, climate change and technological change have accelerated greatly over the last four years. And the rhetoric, the discussion, the dialogue, and what we spend time working with has ramped up very considerably in that. But we must not forget demographic change and demographic change here in Scotland. Okay, some medical charts. This is from the section on demographics, in fact, in the report. Headlines from this, well, on the top left is the growth of Scotland's population over a 20-year period. And of course, there's this whole thing, isn't there, about lies, damned lies and statistics. This would imply that, well, we're doing not too badly, are we? I mean, Scotland's population is growing. The chart on the right, growing a bit. The chart on the right, if you can make it out, the rising graph is the rise in Scotland's population as a consequence of immigration. The falling one is the indigenous population. So Scotland's indigenous population is shrinking. And when I turn to the next slide, this becomes a bit more interesting. And the jiggle on the right, the peaks occur at EU enlargement, for example, in 2004. And this is one of the biggest shadows of Brexit that we have here in Scotland, that growing our human capital is to a greater or lesser extent related to immigration, is related to demographics, and the loss of freedom to travel and the single market and so on has an impact, very significant or potentially very significant impact in Scotland. The map, one of the popular propositions around about growth in Scotland is that the east of Scotland was growing well, the west of Scotland was not. Growth was better in the east, less good in the west, and other areas were shrinking. The map is interesting because what it demonstrates this point about urban concentration. I don't know whether you can make it out or not, but the areas of green were the only bits in Scotland that were growing, and that shows quite clearly this proposition around urban concentration. So Aberdeen, Edinburgh city region, Glasgow city region to a lesser extent, were growing. All of the rest of Scotland was shrinking. The grey and the black is just the rate at which it was shrinking. And we now see, as a consequence of Brexit, the current propositions is that Scotland's population will start to shrink considerably by 2025. This is a fundamental proposition for Scotland's ability to grow its human capital. The table demonstrates this. I was asked to do some work for the Irish last year. I was part of a table that the Irish government showed based on Irish government data and World Bank data. Scotland's population over the period 1970 to 2020 has grown by 5%. Finland by 20%. The Netherlands by 22%. Norway 38%. Ireland 67%, but there are some very particular reasons around about the demographic data in Ireland. New Zealand is 78%. I believe Australia is something like 99%. Now, it's not the position of the authors of this work to advocate growth or not, but it is our position to try to make this position very clearly. And I should say, I mean, although the source data for this is National Register of Scotland, they are at pains to point out, of course, if you look at the local authorities that make up the green, the black and the grey, there are growth points in those local authorities and there are shrinkage points as well. Nonetheless, the pattern is there. There is a demographic issue that we face. So if you think about that demographic issue, and then you think about the issues around about climate change and the issues around about technological change, I didn't go into that in too much, but augmented reality, machine intelligence, machine learning, this is really a potentially very significant paradigm that we're moving through, paradigm change in Scotland. Just to highlight one or two of the other things, this is on the left here, Mark's favourite chart, which shows the growth or otherwise housing construction in the period since the Second World War. And the grey is the public sector delivery, and the purple is private sector delivery. And if you know your history and you're into these things, you can look at that and you can recognise when we were building new towns, you can recognise when there were changes of government, when the right to buy came in, when that was finally cancelled here in Scotland. You can also see when the global financial crash came, and you can start to see the start of the consequences of the pandemic on that, but we don't know when any uptick might arise as a consequence of that. And in conversation with Mark the other day, he was saying to me that to some extent that also shadows what's happening in the property market generally over this period of time, but Mark can speak to that later. The chart on the right it indicates actual preferences that Mark and his team have been able to get out of the marketplace, so that 25% of people have already said they are downsizing their offices. That is their choice. There's a lot of detailed contextualization to that because people are looking for places that adequately deliver on the ESG agenda, the quality of it. The pale grey, I think, is the unknown, and the darker grey are the people who are looking to make it much the same or grow the market. Well, this is complicated. It's a pretty chart. I like it because I'm a designer. It's pretty. In terms of reading the reports, just to mention, we had a colour code. So when you look at the performance of the cities and the city regions, grey represents the granite city of Aberdeen. Green is the Deer Green place of Glasgow, and imperial purple represents Edinburgh and Edinburgh city region. What's interesting about this, I think, nonetheless, is that although you can, of course, see, and it takes an experienced eye like Mark and his team to recognise the subtle differences between the three cities and the three city regions, the patterns by and large remain the same. Mark and others in real estate are always advising people like me, well, it depends how far through a particular cycle Edinburgh, Glasgow or Aberdeen is, and what the nuances are. People who are here today will know a great deal more about that than I do, for example. This is a chart of the three cities, the city regions against Scotland, showing knowledge-intensive business services, which is really incredibly important, and it demonstrates what we all know very clearly. So the lighter shade is the city region, the darker shade is the city, and from this we see, as we might expect, that the three cities themselves perform very well in terms of the number of knowledge jobs within the cities, and also, as expected, that the success of Edinburgh, not only in terms of the percentage of jobs really in not of the knowledge sector within the city itself, but in the city region also. Of course, the capital city status is something to do with that. But as you see in the next slide, only Edinburgh really, amongst the Scottish cities, performs alongside the likes of Cambridge or other regional cities in the southeast of England. Well, there's a lot of detail stuff around about PricewaterhouseCoopers' good growth proposition, and the basket of indices is in the little blue diagram on the left. The charts just pull out where the Scottish cities or city regions are in respect of good growth, and if you can make the one out in the centre, you'll see Aberdeen and Glasgow underlined. Aberdeen and Edinburgh near the top of that in terms of good growth. Glasgow sitting mid-table. Glasgow's figures are always distorted, and its knowledge figures are always distorted by the post-industrial legacy that the city seeks to own and deal with. In the charts on the right, devolved nations, and of course, curiously, it flips from one chart to another. So the chart in the middle, you want to be near the top. The charts on the right, you want to be near the bottom. But in terms of PwC's work on good growth, on the devolved cities, for example, it's all of the Scottish cities outperform the devolved cities in the other devolved nations. Well, this does take us into levelling up territory. On the right is a Boston box that positions Aberdeen and Edinburgh well in respect of good growth, and you see Glasgow's performance mid-table. Can't quite remember if Dundee is in there or not. On the left is a diagram. The contrast is not terribly clear, but the red dots are the primary urban areas, of which there's 60 something in the UK, identified by the Centre for Cities, and the agglomerations. And you'll see Central Scotland very clearly, you'll see Teesside clearly, you'll see Greater Manchester linking into the West Midlands, the Northern Horseshoe, you'll see the South Wales cluster, and of course London, Greater London and the South East. In terms of the points about the UK being a putative super city system, similar to the Ruhr or the Randstad or Bostwash or NorCal-SoCal, Northern California, Southern California, what we see is that actually the connectivity in this is as important as anything else. So in terms of UK cities borrowing scale from one another to perform within a 60 million super city competitive region, we are still hugely dominated by London in the southeast. So if you have strong links, you've got an air link to London as much as anything else, then you are in a stronger position than a regional city which doesn't have that. So this is from the levelling up work. The depth of that work is fantastic. The diagram on the left is the economic planning regions of the UK, the 3 devolved nations, and the 9 economic planning regions of England. Very good. That shows GVA per capita, and on that measure, only Scotland, the southwest of England and the east of England, comes second to Greater London and the southeast, which of course head the table. The whole of the north is a little behind, and there's still particular challenges, of course, in Wales, northeast of England and Northern Ireland. The centre pulls out the clusters that the levelling up, pulls out the urban agglomerations that the levelling up white paper concentrated on, which there's 5, and they're the predictable ones. And the one on the right are the clusters, the business clusters and industry clusters, which we think in many respects is as good and as relevant, although we need to be careful that the consequences of this leads to competitive competition for green free ports, whatever, rather than necessarily looking at how ministers we can make every city above average, which is the kind of other worry about the proposition. The concept is fantastic. We want to bring not everybody can be above average, so by definition. So that's a sort of fundamental challenge. Geography, we think, is really an incredibly important part of a lot of what we have to deal with, and we see that very clearly, and we see it very clearly when we come into Scotland. Now, the diagram on the left here shows the zones identified in the other NPF4 by Scottish Government, which they're only loose zones, of course, and the draft of NPF4 was intended for consultation. It was intended to provoke comment because it was a draft for consultation and engagement. But nonetheless, there's some curiosities about these zones. I've been saying that I'm that old. I've been doing what I do for about 400 years. And when I started to work, we used to work with tracing paper and pens with ink in them. And this, the central Scotland zone here looks like the tracing paper slipped north in some way, because it cuts out the former industrial areas of Ayrshire. It cuts out the bits of South Lanarkshire that are part of the Glasgow conurbation, for example, and it cuts out half the Lothians as well. So it's interesting. I mean they are they're areas in defence of colleagues in Scottish Government to promote discussion, to get us all thinking. I think a lot of us like the fact that there's 5 words associated with these zones, and there's a different emphasis on these 5 words depending on which zone you find yourself. But when you map those on top of the development agencies that we have, which is in the central diagram there, Highlands and Islands, the Scottish enterprise and then the South of Scotland enterprise, you know, they don't quite fit, nor do they fit with the city, region, and growth deals, which is the coloured mosaic on the right. This is important because government action and funding tends to be delegated to local authorities and their partners. And if you've got local authorities divided up in one way or another, it becomes complicated when those funds can be used for one part or not necessarily another part. So it goes to the heart of what our colleague Duncan Macmillan from the University of Glasgow would talk about as we need to practice better geography in terms of the relationship between physical geography, human geography, and economic geography. We need to understand that and understand those complexities better, perhaps. Continuing at the Scottish level, slightly clearer diagram on the left of the growth areas. Why is it though? Why is it that the epicentre of Scotland always remains white in these diagrams? So the very centre of Scotland, which is Clackmannan and Falkirk, where there is really some very serious national infrastructure, isn't necessarily included, but we see it surrounded by all of the other city region areas and city region deals and the growth deals, which was probably a good compromise by the then coalition government and the Scottish government in terms of aggregating things together in order to be able to do things for the people and their places. On the right is the three principal cities together with Dundee, and it gives me the opportunity to make the point that only those four cities elect a city government to deal with the administration and development of the city. The other three, now four cities, don't. And I think we think this goes to the heart of, in some respects, what makes a city and how a city functions. So let me give you a quote from the press recently, for example. The official title of city gives us wider recognition that we deserve as one of the fastest growing urban areas of Scotland, offering all the amenities that any modern city could cope and hope for. And it goes on to say, of course, we already know and have always known that we're a city. That's why we have the city car park, the city hotel, and city cabs. But it's great to finally get recognition of this. It's cheap, if you like, to have a go at the likes of Dunfermline. But the way we do things at the moment is that we have a Scottish Cities Alliance where all of the cities have a seat at the table. It was 7, it will now be 8. That excludes all of the new towns, for example. It excludes Falkirk Grangemouth, it excludes Paisley. And as we say in the report, having the monarch make a city to coincide with a jubilee, for example, is quaint, it's British, it's ceremonial, but it isn't any way to run a country or run an urban system. So coming through all of this is a strong recommendation that having a cities alliance is a good thing, but let's get real about the representation on that, about the delegation to it and the governance of it. And we're also, I think, making a strong plea that as well as the three principal cities, Dundee should be increasingly be thought about as part of that group. Now, you know, to my eternal shame, when Urban Age 1 was published, we were asked why isn't Dundee part of this, and to my shame I said, well, it would then become Scotland's Urban Aged rather than Scotland's Urban Age, although when you look at demographics that's probably quite accurate in some respects. But there are some interesting bedfellows in the four cities. So in those four cities, Aberdeen, Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Dundee, the city that is the largest territorially and the city that is the smallest territorially have virtually the same density. So one of them is 200 plus square kilometres and one of them is about 60 square kilometres, but they're more or less the same density. That's to do partly with the number of people, but maybe not only with the number of people. Two of the cities are almost exactly the same territory, but one has 3 times the population of the other. So that in itself tells you something about geographical disparity, if you like. Nonetheless, over the years, we found a way to work with the cities, to work with the city regions. There's a strong plea in the work that we do not further overcomplicate the geography. So here are the 3 principal city and city regions at the same scale. So you see when Joe read out the extent of the land area, which is city regions, by the way, the land area, the population, and the contribution to GVA. This is them all to the same scale, and it does, if you think about these things, pose certain questions in your mind about why, for example, we insist on having Scottish borders as part of the Edinburgh city region. The Edinburgh city region goes through the middle of Fife, excuse me, but you do see nonetheless that cluster around the Forth that functions extremely well as a contemporary city and city region, and is doing very well in UK and international terms. You see the shape of the Glasgow city region reflects actually reflects the catchment area of the River Clyde. And again, there is logic for that, apart from maybe some of the headwaters in South Lanarkshire. But if you think that one of the central national projects of NPF4 is Mission Clyde, and the Clyde and its tributaries run through every community in the managed metropolis that, well, we hope managed metropolis that is Glasgow in the west of Scotland. When you start to then take into account climate change, which has got sea level rise, has got surface water challenges, you realise here's 30+% of Scotland's population with very considerable issues to face. Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, well, I'm fond of saying it's a little bit like Copenhagen's finger plan, the corridor up to Peterhead in the north, the corridor south to Stonehaven, Montrose, and the three inland axes. There's a very settled arrangement between the city of Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire that functions very well. They get on well. These regions by, and with the exception, I mean, it's a curiosity that borders are part of the Edinburgh city region, but people have figured out how to make it work. It just starts to get complex if they're also part of the South of Scotland Development Agency. And you know, when we're talking about productivity, simplification of these things rather than making them more complex help us. Right, to move towards conclusions then, towards the end of the report, we moved into systems thinking. So rather than dealing with things on an individual basis, we've got a transport system, we've got a housing system, we've got an economic system, we've got a movement system. We don't got a place system, and yet place is a sort of central thinking for a lot of the Scottish Government's policy and regulation. We touched on donut economics from Kate Rayworth, the 2 diagrams on the left. Her proposition was a curious name for a book, but obviously a donut. But the point about the comfortable zone for human habitation being between the ecological ceiling on one hand and the safe care of everyone on the other is shows all of the areas where we are bursting that in terms of the ecological ceiling and in terms of social and human care on the inner ring. On the right is the Taylor-Wessing report, or the outcome of that was Taylor-Wessing did together with the College of Estate Management, the University of Reading, talks about the multifunctional centres of our cities, and the 4 key propositions there about building local capacity, and the one in the bottom right talks about partnership and coordination, and I think we would stress we need systems thinking for that, particularly when we are dealing with the inconsistencies and the unknowns that we face over the coming years. And we talked about the possibilities of using scenario thinking, and these are just some of the examples that we've used in the report. On the left, the scenarios for business, I think, and on the right, the scenarios for retail. To encourage our cities and our partners to think about varied outcomes and how you might adjust levers between one set and another set. And then we brought those together, and on the diagram on the left, the post-COVID scenarios and the normal that are we going back to normal? Are we going to create a new normal, or it will just simply, in British pragmatic terms, be the next normal? We'll apply some sticking plaster over here, we'll apply some sticking plaster over there, and all we find, we'll get on with it. I think everybody who's sentient recognises that the only way to properly overcome the pandemic or the consequences of the pandemic and decarboning and the climate emergency is really to get stronger alignment. But in order to be able to do that, national governments, as was clear at COP last year, are really starting to come to terms with the consequences of what that will mean for taxation systems and every other dimension to that. Now, it's tremendous that the ESG agenda now appears in the Treasury Green Book, which of course is the Bible in terms of the governance of projects and their fundability and deliverability. But bringing that into alignment with, on the right there, the scenarios for climate change are really important. And I should stress that in the report, the colours don't have, it's not a traffic light system other than with respect to the climate change, where owning the transition is something that we need to focus on. Well, look, I'm sorry, there's a lot to this, and you've all been incredibly patient because there's slides with a lot of words. I just simply wanted to highlight briefly in these last 2 slides the 7 outcomes of the report. First of all, are in the international context, recognizing that in international trends there's a new localism infusing what is confusingly referred to as hybrid living, for example, but stressing the integrated and indivisible nature of the Sustainable Development Goals, which takes us into systems thinking, the place principle, and how the place principle from Scottish Government, which relates primarily to the public sector, although to be fair, it's probably fair to say that the private sector is enthusiastic around about the proposition that everybody works together. It's harder to achieve in the public sector in terms of delivery of outcomes for both of the NPS. Competitiveness and productivity, we need to focus on human capacity and skills, and alignment of collaborative governance as a prerequisite for dealing with productivity and disparity in productivity across the cities of Scotland and the UK. And then there's passages around about the age cities, talked a little bit around about Scottish Cities Alliance, for example, but also empowering innovation and capacity in urban policy, urban design and urbanism through devolved responsibility and resources to the cities, the city regions and their partners. Responsibility for delivery, if we think about Scotland and British cities compared to the European cities that we compare ourselves with and the North American cities, there is much greater devolution of governance and financial responsibility. Not necessarily, this is not advocating additional taxation, but rather that cities are empowered to do things and do things better in respect of their people and places. Geography, governance in the age cities I've talked about. As we go forward with NPF4, let us not further complicate the geography of Scotland. If anything, let's clarify it. Support coherent regional planning, maybe regional agencies to coordinate policy development and delivery around about coherence in respect of place. If we're serious about a well-being economy and you're dealing with Mrs. McGlumphy, then the quality of people's places and the quality of their life is how we have to translate all of this to take them with us on the decarboning agenda. Glasgow and the West of Scotland, which I obviously know well, the recent work looking at retrofitting, there's 450,000 homes need to be retrofitted. It's a huge issue and a huge challenge. We have to find a way of reassembling all of this language in a way that's accessible to people, that help them with the quality of their lives and the quality of their place. And we also have to find a way of funding it as well. And then finally, we talked about the genius loci, the spirit of the place, and the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. That cocktail of change, but the fact that Scotland's cities, their richness and the quality of their environment is something that we think should be maintained. So we need to ameliorate the change to ensure that that does happen. And then finally, Richard, you'll be delighted to know, report card on Scotland's urban age. One, without doubt, the paradigm shift in terms of industrial to knowledge city is ongoing. The trends are very clear, but they're accelerating. So it becomes incredibly important that some of these, when we start to talk about we need to do things and we need action, we need to know what that action is and why we're taking that action, and make sure it's appropriately targeted, lest we repeat mistakes from the middle of the 20th century in terms of modernist planning, for example. The jet age, net age reinforcement remains true in terms of urban concentration, but there is a distinct move in terms of local distinctiveness and the distinctiveness of some of the settlements outside of both Edinburgh and Glasgow, and indeed Glasgow bleeding into Ayrshire as well. The transition in terms of reinvention or replication, reinvention is the only game in town. Trying to replicate what you did before, it'd be nice to go back to the way we used to do things, is not an option. Yes, our cities are proto-knowledge and are really now knowledge cities. Do the international trends affect the Scotland and the UK, particularly in terms of the UK as a super city system, borrowing scale one city to another? Jury is out. We'll see how we get on with levelling up, or whether or not it becomes pork barreling for, as the Americans would say, for politicians. Familial likeness remains true. In terms of the performance of Aberdeen and Edinburgh and Glasgow, it's changed a little bit. Aberdeen is perhaps, for understandable reasons, most challenged by the zeitgeist Glasgow is transitioning well. Edinburgh shows the productivity bonus, but we wonder as well, I suppose, or at least I do, whether or not there's a danger, which I think Edinburgh is conscious of. Edinburgh becomes Scotland's boutique city, and in the process prices the Scots out of Edinburgh, which is a sort of issue, I think, that there's a risk Edinburgh could face. Dundee is a deserved partner, and then Urban Scotland, assemble and borrow scale. Let's concentrate on that. I mean, we are talking about electrifying the line up to Aberdeen, which is great, but will it go any faster? Will you be able to get to as I said yesterday, there's a danger that instead of moving gracefully through Fife noisily, we will then move gracefully and slowly through Fife quietly. But I think we want to be able to move a bit more quickly, particularly if we're serious about other things. Levelling up remains unproven, and the Scottish Cities Alliance remains ill-configured and underpowered, but could be made potent and powerful. Thank you very much for your patience. Thanks to this collaboration of partners who've participated. Joe, back to you.